What's the silliest thing you've been fired for? Story 1. I got fired once for having emergency gallbladder surgery. We had a phone deposition with HR and the unemployment judge. After they explained when I was fired, the judge asked them why they didn't offer me FMLA. They said he didn't ask. The judge said, "It's your job to offer him FMLA. You're lucky he didn't sue you. Unemployment approved." Story 2. I took a coffee mug home from the office kitchen on a Friday. Got a call from HR on Saturday asking me to come in for an emergency meeting and was fired on the spot. Turns out I was seen by security walking out with company property, the coffee mug from the office kitchen. Later, I was able to prove it was my personal mug and was offered my job back, but I declined to return. Story 3. While working in the produce section of a grocery store in Iowa, someone heard me talking about stocking cherries, which in their mind was stalking cherries, virgins. And the next thing I knew, me and the produce manager were outside, and he offered me a ride home because my parents were working. I walked home, and randomly someone threw a McDonald's cheeseburger at me and hit me in the back of my leg. Weird day. Story 4. Got fired for being a no-show, no-call. The manager lied and said I never contacted her and was shaking like a leaf. Went to the owner and said, "Here's my outgoing call to get the day before saying I had the fever and chills, etc." It was my phone record showing I called the manager's number in a 90-second call. 2 weeks later, they confirmed that wasn't the only thing she was lying about, embezzlement dollar, and they offered me my manager's job. I said only if they gave me her rate and benefits. They said they couldn't do that and I wouldn't budge. I drove back to the business and shook hands, and they were apologetic, but I hated that job anyway. Story 5. I was fired for not being available after hours as an hourly employee, was never allowed to take my laptop home during Ramadan. A client experienced an outage, and I was the only one in the area while the boss and family were out camping. I filed a case with the Department of Labor. Story 6. Not technically fired. I was an IT contractor for a while. The client firm decided to make some contractors permanent. I was one of 2 on my team. Only one was going to get the job. The other would not have their contract renewed. I was the better engineer. He was the better socializer. He got the job. ETA. It's not like I was some asshole that no one liked. My colleague was a smoker, but I'm not. A number of long-time existing permanent staff were also smokers, so they all had more face time with each other, and it was more casual. Also, I'm not nearly as bitter about this as it may sound. It was disappointing at the time and led to some rough times for a bit, but now I'm doing much better professionally than I probably would be if I was still there. Story 7. I was working in electronics at Walmart. There was an actual rule that you could not check out family member, but the unspoken rule was that if you knew someone well enough to know their first name, you weren't allowed to check them through your line. I was working the day after Black Friday. I had a line going out the back of the department. I was the only damned cashier in electronics. A friend of my mother's was apparently in my line. I had already started scanning items when I looked up and realized it was someone I knew. She didn't even have any freaking electronics. I went ahead and checked her through. A coworker reported to management that I had checked my mother through my line. They were both overweight, same age, similar haircuts, glasses. I understand the mistake as I hadn't been working there very long. Even when I explained to management who it actually was, they said I should have stopped and called a manager to come cancel the transaction and walk her to the front of the store to be checked out by someone else. So because I checked someone I knew in passing through my line instead of waiting for a freaking manager during the Black Saturday rush and holding up my line for as much as 10, 15 minutes, I got fired on the spot. Story 8. I was too eager to prove myself. I'm a classically trained woodworker, did 3 years of shop class in high school and a full year of college after that. Worked as a custom woodworker for a year and a custom cabinet maker for 3. And they wanted me to wait so they could train me how to laminate boards together. Didn't even need to be flush as they flattened them on a CNC afterwards. Story 9. Getting to work 6 minutes late. There was an accident on the freeway and they said that was not a valid excuse. I happily signed the paperwork and walked out with a smile. The manager asked why I was not upset, and all I said was, "Why should I be? You're losing your best asset." He laughed and said I was always too confident. The business went bankrupt and shut down just a few months after that. It was a coincidence because I wasn't that good of an employee. Story 10. I got fired for quitting once. I worked in a shop that modified laptops. People wanted the latest Asus laptops, but with special thermal paste or a faster processor or whatever, so we'd swap parts out and do whatever the customer asked and then put it all back together. This was an okay gig for me. It wasn't in my wheelhouse, but it was different from the crap jobs I'd taken before, and so I stuck with it for as long as I could. Until one day, there was a particularly tricky modification required of one laptop. Tricky enough that 3 different people, including myself, ended up doing different things to the laptop. Typically, if there was some kind of mod needed that only the owner was comfortable doing, they were the only one to handle the whole computer. So for 3 people to with one lappy was weird. Somehow, in the kerfuffle of passing the thing around the office, the i9 went missing. Instantly, the blame falls entirely to me. I scour my workstation and tear everything apart. The chip isn't there. I try to point out that 3 ING people touched the thing, but the owner insisted they didn't lose it, and the other guy had been working there too long to make that kind of mistake. A couple of days go by, and a friend of mine that works there tells me the higher-ups think I stole the chip to resell it. They then tell me that the owner is actually a reasonable person. And if I just go in and talk about how 3 people, including them, handled the machine, likely they would just split the cost of the missing processor 3 ways and consider it done. When I go back in, I overhear the boss and the other employee that modded the laptop talking about how they don't tolerate this kind of incompetence, and something has to be done, etc., etc. I knock on the office door and ask to talk about the situation. Even though the boss has already just sat around flapping gums about me, he doesn't have time right now. I wait until lunch and go try his office again. He's again in his office, again just so happening to be discussing incompetence and theft in the office with the same employee who is nodding their head in agreement. The boss still doesn't have time to talk to me. When I leave for lunch, I don't go back. I call my previous employer and ask for my job back. They're happy to have me. I stay home confident in my decision. A couple hours later, I get a call from my secretly ex-boss. They want to know why I'm late. I tell them I got my old job back and don't appreciate all this avoidance and accusation without even talking to me, just about me. They go, "You realize what you just did, right? You walked on a job, you're fired." They said themselves, "You walked, so you're fired." "Whatever," I say. "I'll come get my last paycheck next Monday." I get my check without incident and resume my previous gig as a taxi driver. The cost of the processor was not deducted from my check. Story 11. Oh, I'll never forget this. Used to work at a restaurant and came back in college during summer to make some extra money. Surprised to see some new faces, but that's the industry for you. New interim manager filling in while old manager was off training, running food service expo shows. Had apparently set aside some ice cream for herself in the freezer and pulled me into the office to ask why I ate it. I obviously didn't have any idea what she was talking about and told her, so she fired me for insubordination or some such nonsense. Probably my 3rd day back. Think I was 18 at the time. Still can't tell if she was threatened by me or what. Either way, that place and that lady. Story 12, not fired, but laid off because the company was downsizing. I was one of 2 in my department. I did quality work and was always in the office. The other guy was a slacker and would lie about work he did and didn't show up half the time. They let me go over him because he had been working there longer. Story 13. For going to work. I interviewed with the GM of a restaurant, did the walk around, accept the offer, and got the company apron. Showed up for my first day, and the AM told me the GM never let him know anything. Took my apron. GM called me to fire me at the end of my first week for no call/no show. Story 14. Not telling my kids to leave me alone to work when I was stuck at home after COVID hit. I had 3 kids, all elementary school aged at the time, and we were taking things very seriously since it was a few months in. My divorced manager of adult children who did not live with him, he was working from home with his dogs to keep him company, told me I needed to focus on my work and ignore my kids, and if they came to the door knocking and needing me, I should just tell them to go away and that I had to do my work. At that point, I welcomed a PIP and just silent quit until they let me and a number of my coworkers go. I still don't regret my actions. Story 15. Back when I was in my teens, I got a job working for a supermarket in their bakery department. I was going on break and decided to get myself a treat and asked the manager to ring me up, and he said, "It's on me, don't worry about it." I said, "Cool," and went upstairs to the McDonald's area to enjoy my strawberry cheesecake ice cream in a cup with a sugar cone on top. After my break, I went back downstairs where the head manager was waiting for me and said I was fired for stealing ice cream. I tried to explain my side of the story, but she wouldn't listen. I was fired for ice cream because my manager told me that I didn't have to pay, even though I had every intention of paying. To this day, I believe there was a conspiracy to get me out and that I was set up by Heather and her cronies. Never trust any coworker or manager and always pay for ice cream. Story 16. Hired to work on water pumps with no prior experience. I worked on pumps, welded frames for solar panels, and made systems for it. I laid pipe and installed sprinkler systems, installed pool systems, learned to use a forklift, sell plumbing stuff from the shop. I got fired for not knowing why the solenoid was not working, and spent half a day trying to fix it and then replaced it. Story 17. I worked at Old Navy for maybe 3 months back in 2009. I was fired because I didn't show up for work one time. I literally could not leave the house. We had a major ice storm, and I lived on a dead-end dirt road in the middle of the woods. A large tree had fallen across the road, and we were always one of the last roads in town to get cleared anyway. I explained this to my manager. She accused me of lying and told me not to come back in. Story 18. In a small tennis pro shop as a summer job during college, I greeted everyone and asked if there was anything I could help with. If not, I just let them shop until and unless they asked about something. Apparently, I shouldn't have asked and should have just followed them around being a pushy salesman. This was ostensibly so obvious. I was fired for not being aggressive enough with sales without ever being told I was expected to be the worst stereotype of a salesman. And I don't think it was a cover for anything else because I worked 3 other jobs at the same private community both before and after that, and everyone else thought I was great with the members. The pro shop was independently owned, so it was different bosses. Story 19, my sales went up. It was an inbound call center. I made a slight change to the order in which I read the upsell offer paragraphs. I didn't change the words at all. My sales went up because I was giving the explanation and offer in a more logical order. Supervisor said, "Just read the script." I explained what I was doing and why. I showed the statistics. I suggested having the marketing group modify the script so everyone's sales could similarly improve. Supervisor said, "Just read the script." Technically, I quit before they could fire me, but I knew the paperwork was in progress. Story 20. Worked at a grocery store. On my first day, I put in a time-off request for 3 months in the future for my wife's college graduation. Followed up regularly with reminders to my supervisor. Week before, when the schedule gets released, sure enough, I am scheduled for that day. I told my boss and she said tough and handed me a directory of employees to call to ask to cover my shift. I, of course, was not going to miss my wife's graduation and was fired. Story 21. I didn't take my break at the right time because I was with a customer. Later that day, I refused a service call because it was near the end of my shift. It was going to take me 40 minutes to get there and there was a no OT rule in effect. By the time I would have arrived, I'd be on OT. I was fired. I disputed with the union, and they said because I took my break at the wrong time, the decision held. My boss was an asshole with a hit list of people he planned to fire. I was the last one, and I made it really hard for him to find cause. Story 22. Not shaking someone's hand and asking their name. I worked at Pep Boys and was a damn good salesman. I also could tell when someone wanted to get there and get out and not deal with people. Our district manager was there when I refused to shake someone's hand and walk me out. They stopped that bull like 2 months later. Story 23, I've got 3. One was that I didn't want to be friends with the new boss and hang out outside of work with her and my coworkers. Apparently, I wasn't enough of a team player, and it brought down morale for her. I was well liked by the rest of the staff and would have and did hang out with them outside work. I just disliked the boss. The other was when I was a newer employee at a company and got sick with the flu. I used sick time and was out for a week. That Monday, they enacted a new attendance policy. By being out for the week, even though I had accrued and was using all my sick time, I violated it. I was talked to by HR who understood that I was not there to be briefed or anything about the new attendance policy since I started after the company-wide briefing and was out when it started. I was fired that Friday for violating the new attendance policy. The most recent one was back in June. Your benefits kick in at day 90 of employment. Me and 44 other people were laid off on which day? You guessed it, day 89. I saw the job posting back up on Indeed later that week with a $3/hour decrease in starting pay. Story 24. Got fired because I reported a child protection issue. The agency wanted rid of me as there was a lot of money being made by a lot of unqualified and unvetted friends and family of management. A few weeks later, the recession kicked in and the agency was shut down anyway. Story 25. While not me, a CPA was fired for not falsifying records. Dude head dove into termination and walked out with integrity. The guy's literal name is Rock. Amazing guy. My manager was his adoptive daughter who quit the next day. They refused to do illegal white-collar crimes, and he blew the whistle on what they were doing. And the IRS does, in fact, not around. Edit. The company was essentially stealing from clients in a very complex way. And my department was selling customer data to Johnson & Johnson, who paid in computers, monitors, chairs, and oddly enough, paper. Story 26. There was this form that my manager had to fill out every day at noon. Only managers were allowed to retrieve, print, and fill out the form. She was in the security office crying one day and couldn't do it, so she made me jump through all these hoops to get it done by noon by asking every single manager to do a separate part of the task. She was crying for hours. Boyfriend thing, IORC. The form wasn't that big of a deal but was standard procedure and could have gotten us into minor trouble if the right person came in for an audit that day at that exact time. Anyway, a few weeks later, she's in the office crying for hours again. I kept calling her to get the form done, but she wouldn't respond. I guess she just assumed that I'd jump through all of those hoops again. The problem was that I had no idea what file to ask a manager to open, where the executive printer was, none of it. It was too many random steps that I'd have to ask too many people to do in pieces, and I had only done it once. Anyway, I couldn't get it done that day, and another manager pulled me into the office a few days later, interrogated me about the form and why I didn't do it. Said he wasn't aware that Megan was crying for the entire shift. Fired me anyway. Story 27. Some father believed that I was whispering in his 3-year-old's ear to cuss, or allowing the other kids I was babysitting to whisper in his daughter's ear to convince her to have a potty mouth, while he swore up and down that he absolutely did not cuss around his daughter, and that the only time he cussed when she was at his house was when he was playing video games with his headset while she was in bed sleeping. She was the lightest sleeper I had ever cared for. Meanwhile, Mom had had custody of her since before summer, so I hadn't even had his daughter in months. I only babysat her when Dad had custody, and the week she came back to me, she was cussing like a sailor. Already seemed to be a habit. I had been watching her for years, so it broke my heart. I had never had a parent remove their child from my care before. I suppose it was the straw that broke the camel's back, because Dad was also annoyed with me for not having her potty trained, even though supposedly she was fully trained at his house. He kept her on the pot 24/7, but at my house she refused because she was worried about the other kids playing with and taking away her toys. We would sit on the potty for half an hour before nap time, but she would hold it until I laid her down for a nap, and he thought I was slacking and not really trying. But as soon as I would lay her down and leave the room to go clean up after lunch, she was trying to have a bowel movement. If I noticed what she was doing, I would take her to the toilet, but she would scream bloody murder and disturb the other kids' naps. Story 28. I was training to be a 911 operator in a very large metro area. I, with my trainer listening in, received a 911 call around 3 a.m. from a woman, maybe 45, 50 years old, crying because her boyfriend hit her so hard that some of her teeth came out. I asked her things like if she was safe now, did the BF have any weapons, and where she wanted to meet with the officers. In the duration of the 45-60 seconds of asking her those questions, she decided that she didn't want to go through with the process. Common in DV victims upset cops will just upset their abuser more. I offered to arrange to have her meet the officers down the block. This is when my trainer started getting visibly angry. I continued with the woman who was contemplating my proposal. I said he shouldn't be hitting her, and that having the officers come talk with her would at least provide her some options. She said she'd think about it, and before we hung up, I reminded her that we're always here to help everyone in the community, and she can call back anytime. She thanked me and hung up. My trainer was furious. She said she didn't want help. You should have hung up on her right at that moment. I was let go for underperformance, because all our agency cares about is keeping call times under 3 minutes. That was probably a 4-minute phone call. I was given the opportunity to quit my job after they went back and readjusted all my training assessment values to ensure that I wouldn't pass even if I aced every upcoming trial. I was the only trainee in my group of 6 to get 100% on both tests 1 and 2. In my resignation letter, I noted that this job does not meet my definition of helping people and wish the people of the community good luck. Story 29. The place had a point system, 7 points, and they could fire you. You could work points down doing overtime. I was only available for certain days. Specified this in during my hiring, but they continued to schedule me on days I was working elsewhere. Sometimes they would remove the point, sometimes they wouldn't. Talked to everyone I could about it. HR, managers, scheduling people. They couldn't get there together, so I figured if they distribute care, I wouldn't either. Ended up with 3 times the points, so just waiting for them to fire me. Ended up working off the points that didn't fall off over time and found myself below 7 points. Got a call a few weeks later that I was being let go for having too many points. Story 30. Casino about 15 years ago. Refused to arrest a young adult accompanying his mother and allowed him use of the restroom. Boss that was a former cop got into a heated disagreement. The young adult was arguing about his cutoff and had a valid point that he wasn't driving. Due to the fact we bussed him in from out of the area, they could not reasonably kick him off property. He was told to sit outside and wait in the cold winter air with only a light jacket and no ability to use a restroom. I tried negotiating with boss, offered to escort to an outside bathroom, tried getting busy driver to let him use that one. Tried getting a cab to take him. Bridge crossing to fast food joints, was missing a guardrail due to construction and wasn't a safe option. I had a decision to make and let him enter after holding his ID and screening him. I warned him to be quick. He made it out about 2 minutes before they showed up to arrest him. Dispatch had been waiting to give the signal. I got fired for insubordination and was told I should have kicked it up to the manager on duty, which ironically is going outside the chain of command and still insubordination. No regrets. I have to live with myself, and I never made an arrest I was ashamed or embarrassed about. I had to fight and won my unemployment. Story 31. Being 15 minutes late because I got a flat tire on my way to work. It was the shift after I had just gotten a final warning for attendance. But why I was on the final was so stupid. I had put in for a vacation months in advance and made reservations for hotels and booked plane tickets for a trip to Disney World. Anyway, I go on vacation and all is great, but then on Monday my work blew up my phone trying to find out where I was. They had me put down as a no-call, no-show. It was October and I put in for the vacation in May. I had asked my supervisor if my vacation was approved and she told me it was. Well, apparently there was a clerical error and HR forgot to put it in the system. They wanted me to come back immediately and I told them it's not possible. I eventually get back and get dragged into HR with my supervisor and get put on a final warning for attendance. I had 0 write-ups in my 6 years there. Rather than make a big deal about it, I just signed the paper because I figure I have perfect attendance anyway, and this will just go away in 6 months. But then, next day, flat tire and I get axed. Story 32. I had a whole vacation scheduled, plane tickets and all, before getting an offer for a job starting a few weeks before my trip. Recruiter agreed on letting me take those days off. When returned to the office, I found out my boss had denied them days on the system, so I had 10 absences. Got fired, but ended up signing a resignation letter. My first job, of course. Story 33. I worked at a company that did CNC milling/manufacturing for medical-grade parts. I'd be the one reading plans and setting up tooling for the operators. I had been working there for about 6 months, and a nut that secured a bit into the collet split long ways around the nut and damaged the machine. These nuts had a torque spec, and the company provided a torque wrench where the setting torque settings were welded and couldn't be adjusted. They fired me for not following the spec Elmau. Story 34. One of my first bosses had the absolute worst breath in the world. Could smell it from the entrance of the warehouse. It was a moving company I worked at in high school. But one day, it hit hard, and I was like, "Hey man, I'm pretty sure you have tooth decay because your teeth are white, but it smells like you poop from your mouth." I was being honest, and ever since that, I wasn't getting any deliveries. Master electrician now with my own company, but man, I'll never forget that. Story 35. I made 12 sample wedding cake cups for an order. To visualize, they're about 4 ounces cups filled with a pop of buttercream, 1 layer of filling cake, then another pop. I forgot to add the layer of raspberry filling to them, so I scraped the top icing off and was getting the cake out to add the layer when my boss comes over to me and starts yelling at me that I'm wasting product and I'm incompetent and to get the out. So I left. Over 2 ahs of buttercream. That lady was a bitch as a person. Her shop closed about 6 months after I left, so I don't even worry about it, haha. Story 36. Wasn't directly fired, but quit ahead of them giving me a disciplinary. The reason? The company specialized in care residence for young people with mental health issues. Company failed to pay rent on a property. Dodged calls from the landlord, who I, as their admin, had a lot of conversations with, so lost the property due to being behind on payments. Company asked me to write a letter to all of the residents in that property, telling them the property had been lost, but blaming it on the residents, claiming it was down to their untidiness and noisiness. To me, if you're dealing with people who are struggling already with things like anxiety and depression, you do not want to be putting undue blame on them. So I refused on the grounds of it being against the company values they supposedly upheld, registered it as a complaint via the formal process. They disobeyed that process, forwarded the concern directly to the people in question, who tried to cover it up and subsequently gave me a disciplinary for spreading misinformation in an attempt to cause a scandal. Story 37. Was working at a plastic bag making factory or whatever it's called. But when I started working there, the guy training me was amazing. He taught me everything he knew and made sure to teach me everything to the letter. Great guy. A few months later, I'm told he's leaving and I'm taking his position. All right, thank you so much, everything you taught me. Years later, he comes back, but takes the office position. I got up to the manager and tell her that I'm fine if he wants his old position back. She says it's fine, he didn't ask for it, so everything's good. I got up to him and tell him the same, and he tells me the same thing. Okay, well, if you ever change your mind, just let me know. I really don't have any issues giving you your old position. A couple months later, I'm doing my job sorting some pallets outside, and by the loading dock, there was a small black berry tree that I've been taking care of because why not? And it's finally growing some. He joins me and asks me if he can ride the forklift for old time's sake. Sure, have at it. Later on, he comes back and tells me to help him take down that tree. And I was like, why? It's not on the way and it's not bothering no one? Yeah, but that's what the boss lady said. But okay, fine. At the end of my shift, I get called to the office and get written up for insubordination for not doing what he had asked me to do. WTF, whatever, sure, I just asked why. But whatever it is, what it is. I got up to him before I left and I apologized and told him I didn't know that that's how he felt and that I just do what I'm told. After all, he was just following orders. The next day when I come in, I get called to the office, and the manager tells me she's firing me for threatening him and cussing him out and whatnot. I was very surprised, and I asked if they could bring him up, and they said no, and to leave immediately before they called the cops on me. Eat it. Literally a day after I got fired, a friend from that place told me they immediately put him in my position. Story 38. I smelled weird. My boss brought it up multiple times until she finally fired me. Literally no one else thought I smelled weird. I asked friends, family, acquaintances, even strangers, getting some strange looks in the process. She couldn't even explain what I smelled like, just weird. The kicker was that it was a law office, and she was a labor attorney specializing in discriminatory firings. I'm sure I could have done something, but I was spectacularly unsuited to that job and didn't care enough to follow up. Story 39. I worked at a library when I was 15 years old. My job was to return books back to their shelves after they had been brought back to the library. Return was on the first floor, and books were on the second floor. There was a girl that I worked with that I began to flirt with when I worked there. We would talk and work at the same time, always stacking books near each other or returning in the same area. Both of us were fired for talking too much. I thought that was going to haunt me forever. Story 40 years ago, I got fired for too much overtime. The thing is, when I would get done my routes with this home medical care company I was supposed to call in, then they would stick me with everyone else's stops. And if you refused to take an additional stop they'd give you, you would be fired right away. I believe it was because I told them it's illegal to have us unload our vans at the end of the day off the clock. Anyway, I haven't worked there in 20 years. Although American Home Patient is still around. Oops. Story 41. I worked in HR. I was fired for not responding to employee inquiries that came through very late at night. We had a global workforce. My boss was in my time zone, so she knew it very late for me, but wanted me to go to bed later so I could serve a global workforce. I was fired a week after I said it and stopped responding past 8 p.m., which is more than reasonable. Story 42. Safeway 2013. High schooler working a summer job as a courtesy clerk. I think I had food poisoning from the taco truck I stopped at while I was walking to work. And about an hour into my shift, I had to take a really heavy dump. I was probably in there for almost 10 minutes, and it truly was a bad one, like not just the smell, but the actual pain. Apparently, the smell had leaked out of the bathroom and made its way to the vegetable area. The bathroom was right at the doors to get into the back at a split between the raw meats and vegetables, to a point where not only were people complaining, but it was so bad that people were straight up leaving the store. Not even a minute after leaving the bathroom, I got pulled into the back and screamed at by the manager for another 10 minutes before she just said GTFO and don't come back. Story 43. My girlfriend was a marketing director. The CEO tasked her with getting his book published. Every single publisher said no to his book. One publisher was nice enough to say, "This book will never be published." In fear that she would lose her job from the constant rejections, she relayed that information to the CEO. He fired her. It's been 6 months. Bank account is almost at zero, and she's still struggling to find new work in this job market. Story 44. Not really fired because it wasn't a job, but an unpaid internship. My degree field requires a certain amount of clinical hours in order to graduate, so I got this internship at a place that was literally a couple of blocks away from my house. I had only been there for a week, so I was still learning everything, and my supervisor told me to come in for a mandatory training for a new computer system that this place was using. On the day of the training, I slept through my alarm and woke up 10 minutes after the training was supposed to start. I texted my supervisor, apologizing and saying that my alarm didn't wake me. I told her that I would still come in and that it wouldn't take too long for me to get there since I lived so close. She texted me back saying, "Don't bother. By the time you get here, you won't be able to get caught up with the training, and I can't fill you in on what you missed." I asked if I could make it up some other day, and she was like, "No, the next training won't be for a while." I felt genuinely terrible. The next day, I got an email from my advisor telling me that my internship was being discontinued. My supervisor said that she was disappointed because not only did I miss the training, but on the first day, when she handed me the manual, I just flipped through it for a few minutes before going back to playing around on the phone. And because I worked on a paper for one of my classes while on the way back from a road trip that we took, she said that she expected better from a student of my caliber. TBH, I should have took it as a red flag. When on my first day there, she told me that she had fired her previous intern. It seemed like her expectations were way too high for someone doing what is essentially unpaid labor. It all worked out in the end, though, because later on, I ended up getting an even better internship with a wonderful supervisor who genuinely cared about seeing me succeed. Story 45. I was poached by a rival company to help them purchase new machinery, install said machinery, develop relevant training and safety programs, and then I was to slide into a supervisory role where I'd focus on process improvement. Spent months basically revamping their entire operation literally from the ground up. 2 weeks from Christmas, I informed the owner that I've effectively finished all the initial phases of my employment and that after the holiday break, I'd be able to slide into the supervisor role. He was pleasantly surprised that I'd finished so early and had me present to him an overview of everything I'd done. I come in the next day and he fired me for time theft because I'd gone and bought 2 pizzas for the guys a week prior. I found out later from another supervisor that he bragged about having planned on letting me go all along. But the best part was that the company folded entirely last year. Turns out that even though I had trained everyone on the machinery, nobody knew how to fix it once it broke down aside from me and people that actively worked for the company I came from. And nobody was jumping ship after hearing what happened to me. They ended up basically on life support 3 months after my departure and had to go back to the remaining machinery that they had warehoused but hadn't yet scrapped out. Story 46. I was feeling fine that week until my boss, who already had a cold and was coughing, decided to cough right in front of me. The next day, while working, I started feeling cold and dizzy. When my supervisor visited my desk, I informed her that I wasn't feeling well. Instead of letting me stay put, she made me stand up and go get whatever she needed. Later, as I was about to get lunch, I told her I wasn't sure if I'd be okay and might go home if I got worse, which I did. By the next Monday, I was in bad shape with a high temperature and a terrible cough. My boss called me, and when he heard that I could barely speak, I sensed he felt a little guilty. He then told me I was fired because my supervisor had recommended it. He didn't explicitly say I was being fired because I got sick, but the pity in his voice made it obvious. Story 47. I had a job working at a nonprofit shelter for women. I noticed when I worked overtime, I never got paid for it. When I asked, they told me that nonprofits don't have to pay overtime. I believed them. But one day, after about 2 years working there, I called the labor department about something else. While talking, I casually mentioned that I didn't make overtime. They asked where I worked, and I told them. Then I said, I don't want to report them or anything, though. And the guy was like, yeah, that's out of your hands now. The next time I went to work, they screamed at me, fired me, wouldn't even let me go to my locker to get my stuff. But I did end up getting a back check for a couple $1,000s. Story 48. Not climbing under a sink to shut off the water supply while doing dishes because the faucet didn't work. Management wanted me to use the water shutoff as the faucet, climb under, turn on the water, rinse stuff, climb under, turn it off. Few minutes later, climb under, turn it back on. She didn't want to waste water by just letting me wash and rinse. Story 49. Inability to teleport or the inability to be 2 places at once. How was supposed to know that the bigwig I was entertaining and was the only one that showed up to their event and was expected to be there, was a key supporter and ally and would have thrown a fit if no one was there, was the wrong choice. Over attending a different simultaneous event that the C-suite and VPs were at with another key supporter, which I did not have a relationship. That was the reason they used. It wasn't the reason. My bigwig had read the riot act to the COO and CFO for abject stupidity fairly recently, and they had to reverse a decision, knew I was behind it, and that would be embarrassed if they didn't. I knew I was going down for a while. It was just about protecting my team from the penny pinchers for as long as possible. In that regard, I did my job. Story 51st day, and was there for 2 hours at my first waitressing job ever, and was fired because the customer didn't want a chilled glass for his second round of bottled beer, so I didn't bring one per training waitress's order. How was I fired? The hulking mass of an owner enjoying a family meal and not technically at work was drunk off a bottle of Sambuco stood over me screaming at me. My response was to dissociate because of childhood trauma, I later found out, and that only pissed him off more. Story 51. I got hired right out of college to work as a manager of a new locally owned pet store. The guy was just starting it and wanted to build a brand and expand and stuff. I felt like I probably shouldn't have been hired in the first place. I felt like he was hiring me on vibe alone since I was very young and had no experience doing anything. He hired about 3 cashiers as well, and one by one he fired them. The first one for no showing, I thought that was legit. She tried to get unemployment, and I remember talking to whoever you talked to about that, saying no. We couldn't get a hold of her for 3 days, and then we stopped trying. She wouldn't answer her phone, and she didn't come in for any of her shifts for 2 weeks. I'm pretty sure she's not eligible for unemployment. Then he fired the remaining ones for increasingly ridiculous reasons. The second one he fired because he wasn't enthusiastic enough while he was working there or something. And the third one he fired for some bull reason I can't remember. I figured I was next. I was struggling. I'd be like, we've needed filing cabinets for a while, and he'd be like, well, you should have bought them and then invoiced me to reimburse you. And I was thinking to myself, I don't know who you think I am, but I am a 22-year-old who is 3,000 miles from friends and family living paycheck to paycheck with my boyfriend. I moved out here with, what money was I going to buy filing cabinets with? When I was eventually fired, I decided it was inevitable because I didn't fit in with his fantasy of what a pet store manager should do or what I personally could do. I visited the place recently for the first time in like 16 years, and it is completely different. Different business model, no expansion, but it is still there though. The guy apparently has nothing to do with it though. I think his wife was like, dude, you don't know what you're doing, and took over. I wonder how many people he fired before that happened, LOL. A story 52. When I was young, I worked in a gas station pumping gas and selling cigarettes part-time. There was a big hullabaloo one day when $40 went missing on one of the other guys' shifts. No one could figure out how it happened or where the money went. I found out later that someone miscounted the cash during shift change and one of the guys took it. The owner was so upset he fired everyone whether they had something to do with it or not. He hired an Indian guy who worked every day open to close to replace all of us. Story 53. Because I sent my manager a pissed-off text about my wallet being left in the building after closing. I had the passcode to close the joint but not get back in, so if I opened it up again, the police would have showed up. I got fired a couple weeks after because I apparently threatened my manager. We were just cool with each other merely days before this went down. Story 54. I got fired from my first job a week into my 2-week notice for stealing a $20 check made out to the company. My sister also worked there, and they found the check in the safe a month later. It slipped under the bolt plate that secured it to the floor. I mean, I get it. Theft is theft. But if I really wanted to steal money from them, I'd have taken a $20 bill or higher denomination, not a $20 check that I wouldn't even be able to cash. Also, probably wouldn't have done in during my 2-week notice period.